Hi there, this is Chase Glenn from the Alliance for Full Acceptance, and we are live today with the program Advocacy 201 and using our story, our personal stories to accelerate acceptance. And I'm so excited for what we have set up today. We are hosting two of my friends from GLAAD, and they're going to tell you more about GLAAD and the organization and what they do individually and what the organization does. Yeah, so it's going to be a great day, great time to join us. So we've already got a lot of folks that have come online. So that's great. If you care to, feel free to go and say host a watch party or share a watch party, and that gets the word out even further about the program. So we're so glad that we have such a great group. If you keep interacting in the comments, feel free to tell us what you're thinking and ask questions as the program goes. We want to interact with folks as much as possible today and keep this going back and forth. So again, my name is Chase Glenn. I am the Executive Director of the Alliance for Full Acceptance. AFFA is an LGBTQ advocacy organization based here in Charleston, South Carolina. Our work really centers around a lot of education, and education and advocacy go hand in hand because whenever we go and have conversations with policymakers, decision makers, and talk about the change that needs to happen, to help and support the LGBTQ community, a lot of times there's education that has to go with that. And so, we host conversations like this and really want to amplify the discussions about the LGBTQ community, raise greater awareness, because we know that that is what helps create change. So here we are today hosting this program, Advocacy 201. I want to go ahead and bring in my guests for today. Today we have Mackenzie Hart and Raina Deerwater from GLAAD. How are you all doing?
Great. Thank you so much for having us today, Chase.
Yeah, thank you
Great.
so much. Doing great.
Awesome. Well, I'm going to put myself on the screen here just so we can all sit here together for a moment. I'm so glad you all are here. And, AFFA has had the opportunity to partner with GLAAD in the past on events. Just earlier, well, I guess it was last year, it was late last year, right? That we did a media training here in Charleston, and Mackenzie and Raina came to the area and taught a class on interacting with the media and how to have those conversations. And some of what we're talking about today is similar content, but we're sort of positioning it slightly differently because this is really about individuals and how we can come to understand our personal stories and use our personal stories to create change, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. Well, I want to hand it over to y'all and let you introduce yourselves a little better than I did and talk about GLAAD and what you all do.
Of course. I'll go first and introduce a little bit about what I do at GLAAD, which is to be the coordinator for education and training with the GLAAD Media Institute. And the GLAAD Media Institute is our program that offers education, training, consultation, and research to help accelerate acceptance around the country and world. A lot of what I do in my job is set up different trainings and courses and workshops to help activists and advocates on the ground to help tell their stories, to help move the needle on issues in their area, much like what Raina and I did back in Charleston in September, and that we've done, again, all over the country and world. We do also do work with the entertainment industry, with the media industry, to help make sure that characters on TV and in film and stories being told in journalistic outlets are as accurate and true as possible about the LGBTQ community. And then we also do research, which I'll turn over to Raina to explain a little bit about.
Hi. Yeah, so I am the Entertainment Research and Analysis Associate at GLAAD. So I sit under the GLAAD Media Institute with Mackenzie. So we do a lot of trainings around the country, like they said, but I also specifically do a lot of entertainment research, which is GLAAD puts out 2 reports annually, one about film, one about television, and it's just both holding film and TV accountable for accurate and inclusive representation of our community, and working with them behind the scenes to encourage them to explore specifically like very underrepresented parts of our community, because as well, we'll talk about, like telling your story is important, and people who don't know an LGBTQ person or in real life or have like misconceptions about us, often where they turn and where they can have their hearts and mind opened is through entertainment. So that's what I do in addition to joining other members of the Institute to do trainings around the country. I do several about entertainment itself, but also just general things like this about advocacy and telling your story.
That's awesome. Thank you all so much for being here today again and for being a part of this conversation. So, a little bit of a backstory. AFFA hosted very early on as we started doing these virtual programs. We hosted an Advocacy 101 sort of training, and we hosted Phil Ford, who's a South Carolina lobbyist who works with our South Carolina LGBTQ coalition. He came in and talked about just the basics of advocacy. We talked about sort of legislative process. We talked about the difference between lobbying and activism and advocacy, and we touched on the importance of, one, people being active and advocating for the community, whether you're a member of the LGBTQ community or an ally. But then also we talked a little bit about personal stories and how powerful those can be. So can you all speak to that? Why is it important to use a personal story? What is it about someone's personal story that is impactful?
Absolutely. So the one most important thing about personal storytelling is that it allows people an emotional access point to understand the issue that you're talking about. Raina mentioned a little bit about our entertainment work, trying to make sure that stories are being told, because people might not necessarily understand an issue until they have someone they can connect it with. They might be able to see a stat about LGBTQ issues or trans issues or bi issues or anything along those lines, but until they have someone in their mind that they can picture and relate to, it becomes incredibly difficult for them to be able to sympathize and to understand. By telling your story, you provide them that access point. They might not understand all the intricacies of what you're talking about, but when they listen to you talk, they'll then walk away and when they hear about the issue say, oh, that's like that person Mackenzie was talking about. And they picture me in their mind, and they can picture you in their mind when you tell their story. And that helps them to connect with you, because one major part of personal storytelling is that we all have strength as what we call quote unquote real everyday people. We are people that live lives that are similar to other people in the United States and around the world. We can all connect with each other as human beings, as people that live in our communities, as people that go through the day-to-day of life. And just because you're LGBTQ or you're quote different than who you're talking to, that doesn't mean that they can't understand you and relate to you. And by telling your story, that's one way that they can really connect with you. By doing that, your message will stick, because no longer are they just thinking about statistics or thinking about little pieces of things that they hear. No longer is it just a conversation about laws or about, sadly, hate crimes or something along those lines. Now it's something about a real person that they heard a story from. And when you tell your story, it allows you to frame the entire discussion, because no longer is it just abstract, nebulous facts that people hear or ideas that people hear, lies people hear. It's now a real story they've heard. And so now whenever they hear about the issue you were talking about, you're going to be the first person they think of. The story that you told is going to be the first thing they think of. And while that doesn't mean that you automatically win the messaging war here, it means that the discussion is now on your playing field and people are going to think of you. And this works with media. That's what GLAAD does. We push it a lot with media, but this is also really helpful when trying to enact legislative change. By talking to politicians and relating to them on a personal level, even though they politically might not necessarily want to agree with something, you might be able to reach them because you are a human being like them. And when they hear your story, they're more likely to then say, oh, you know what, I hadn't thought of that before. I want to help with this because I want to help my constituents like Mackenzie or like whoever you are telling your story. And so that's really the power that we all have as storytellers.
So, using your personal story, it's not, maybe is it not always the same story that you use, or the same angle? Is there, depending on your audience who you're talking to, does that make a difference?
Absolutely. Yeah, it makes a difference because we're all, it depends on who you're talking to and it depends on like what message you want to convey. So, for example, like any person has so many different identities, and there are things for each one of those identities that would make a more powerful story. So, for example, I'm from Northern California. So if I was, talking to someone from my hometown, we would emphasize that shared connection. That's like, we both grew up in the small town of Mendocino, California, where we both know exactly like, how this world works from our perspective. But then if I was talking to somebody who I met, in when I lived in South Carolina, that would be a different connection to make. But so we have all these facets of our identities, whether it be where we're from, how we were raised, what we do for work. If you have kids or siblings or, anyone who is LGBTQ or who is in advocacy, those are so many like ways to make connections. Those are tools. So I think it can really be an advantage to identify who that audience is, and figure out how those are powerful things you can have at your disposal to make that connection. And this can change if you're talking to media and it's like a national broadcast and you're like, okay, that's everyone. But you can focus on, parts of you that make your story stick. And you can also be like, okay, we are talking about this through the lens of youth, for example. And then you can share a personal story of someone who is young and just use that personal experience to make the story shine. And then if you're doing if you're doing an interview with like a college newspaper, you can take on that part of your identity. So basically we have everything. Things that make like up every single one of us are things we can use to identify who we're talking to. And then there is what we at GLAAD here call the movable middle, which is when you're making a case for LGBTQ acceptance and change. It's like there are people who are allies who are already on your side or already in the community, and you're like, you don't have to pitch to those people that like we should be respected and have rights. And then there are people on the other end of the spectrum called resistors, who are those who are in purely hateful groups who won't listen to logic, who they can't be moved from their views, and they're the people who like spew terrible things either on the internet or commit atrocities against our community. But those are just two extremes of where the world lands. And so what we call everyone else is the movable middle, which are people who, they don't think of themselves as bigots, and they aren't like bigots, and they're not going to, do anything heinous, but they don't really feel connected with the community. We call them sort of detached supporters. If you ask, they'd be like, of course, I support queer people, I support the community, but everything's fine. You don't have to do anything else. So these are people we kind of have to explain how the scales are not balanced right now. And, you just have a lot, to do, and our voices have power, and, you can join like our cause and do advocacy. And these are people who like, we need all of our voices to speak up for. And you can always, the movable middle, we can kind of identify like anyone we know who is in there. It's like for example, like my grandfather, I love him. He loves me. He doesn't care that I'm gay, but he's, couldn't care about anything else. So what I do is like, we have fun conversation with a lot of arguments, but I love him. But, you just sort of have someone in your life who their heart's in the right place. They just might not have the right knowledge, or they might, have been, a lot of people are scared of speaking up and sounding stupid or ignorant. And so it's our job as people who want to, get these people to work for us and to advocate to us, to not speak down to them, to not like, to make sure that like they know that this is serious, but we're not going to, we need things to move forward, but we're not going to do it like by attacking you. A lot of people in the movable middle get defensive about that. So that's for a lot of our media work and a lot of advocacy work. These are the people we're trying to target per se, and just to let them know that like there's so much to be done for our community. There's so much, like, a lot of progress has been made, but like there is so much more to be done. So these are the people we talk to, and everyone has these people within their personal networks, and can have conversations with them and turn them into little advocates.
Mackenzie, I didn't know if you had anything to add to that.
No, that was great. I mean, that covers a lot of the strategic work that we do, and figuring out how to tell stories that can target this movable middle group is incredibly impactful, especially for people who aren't necessarily doing this work every single day, or for people who aren't working in media, because a lot of times people in the movable middle are kind of left behind, and they're hearing so much from allies like us, as well as resistors who hate everything about us. And having real everyday people, I'm going to use that phrase so much today, I apologize, to kind of explain and share their stories is what's going to be most helpful for people in the movable middle, because then they'll be able to connect with someone real, and the false, hateful messaging coming from resistors won't have the same level of impact.
That's great. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So first, I just want to say, for those who are watching, thank you for joining us. Feel free to make comments here. If you have any questions, or just like, oh yeah, I agree with that, or something that you want to add to the conversation, feel free to put that in the comments, and I'm watching those here on the side of my screen, and we'll do my best to sort of incorporate those into the conversation here today. We want this to be as interactive as possible. So thank you all again for joining us. So let's just get down to it. So how do you tell your story? Is that too broad of a question?
No, I mean, there are so many different ways, but one template that we found to be helpful is kind of this multi-pronged approach. So just a few things that it's important to remember about storytelling is that your story has to be authentic. People are going to see through it if it's not authentic. If you're not speaking truth, if you're making up a story, people are going to be able to tell, or people are going to dig in and find that out. We also kind of advise that you try to speak from personal experience. What I will say about that is that some people do work with marginalized populations, or work with young people, or work with groups that don't necessarily have the same ability or desire to personally tell their story. And so it's not a bad thing for you to tell their stories on behalf of them. But of course, you'll want to reach out to them, work with them to make sure that you have the story as true, as accurate as possible, and that you have their full permission to share it. That's very important. But you can do great storytelling and great advocacy work by telling other people's stories that you know in real life. In a different vein, you want to know your boundaries ahead of time. Emotional stories work. Unfortunately, media picks up a lot of traumatic stories more than happy stories. They tend to get more clicks, get more ratings, everything along those lines. But you don't owe anyone your trauma if you're not willing to share it. You don't owe anyone anything more than you want to share. And so when deciding to tell your story, think about in advance what you're willing to share and what you're not willing to share. And then you don't have to share anything that you don't want to. But just have it in the back of your mind. Know very consciously what you're willing to share and what you're not. So some examples are, you might not, if you're trans or non-binary, you might not want to share your birth name, your dead name, or quote unquote before pictures if you've been through different therapies or medical changes. You might not want to talk about medical issues or surgeries at all. That's personal information, and people don't need to know it if you're not willing to share. Sometimes you might be sharing a story and your sexual orientation isn't relevant. You don't have to share that if you don't want to. Same as relationship status or HIV status. Again, you don't owe this information to anyone. If your story doesn't need it, you shouldn't have to add it if you're not comfortable with that, and know in advance. And then lastly, thinking about history with depression, suicide, mental illnesses, substance abuse, or sex work. We all know on this call that these aspects of life are very stigmatized. There's nothing inherently wrong with you if you've had history in any of these illnesses or sex work or anything along those lines. But unfortunately, society has a very large stigma against it. If you're not willing to share that, if you don't want to face that stigma, and you don't have to, then there's no need to bring that into your story, just because you feel like it might add to it or you feel like it might be what people want to hear. And so that's just important to think about in advance. You just want to keep that in mind, that you want your story to be authentic, you want it to be personal, but you don't need to share more of yourself than you're absolutely willing to share. And that's important. So when telling your story, so think about the stories in your head that you have had, experiences that you've had, stories you can tell, and think about, okay, can I try to work this into this type of plot line that people will tend to respond to because it spells everything out for them? This is kind of the approach that we take at GLAAD. So at the beginning of your story, presenting a challenge that you faced. So explaining something that came up. That was something you had to make a decision on. In general, if you saw someone being bullied because they were LGBTQ or something, and you had an opportunity to step in, but it was going to be difficult, that's a challenge that you faced. So you present that. And then next, presenting your choice. So just explaining what you decided to do and using your choice to demonstrate values that you have. Now, that doesn't mean that you had to make the right choice. A great story could be, yes, I saw someone being bullied because they were LGBTQ. I stood up for them, and because of that, now they are safer in my school because rules were changed. The story could have something different. It could say, I had the opportunity to stand up for them, and I didn't. I made the wrong choice, and I regret that, and I learned from it. And then at the end, you go with the outcome. So you explain what happened as a result of the choice you made. So one example there could be, yes, I stood up for them. I told the school principal, rules were changed, bullying became much less of an issue at my school. Or it could be something, I felt incredibly bad about it, that I didn't help out, so I reached out to the person after the fact. We worked together, and we tried to do a campaign to end bullying in our school. And that campaign might not be over, or something like that. So when telling the story, that was a very bare bones example. But when telling your story, including specific details can be incredibly important because you can really paint a picture. You want to explain something or tell a story in a way that the people listening or reading can picture themselves there. So I might mention that I was living on 60th Street in New York if I'm telling a story about myself. Or I might mention that it was a really sunny night out because it was mid-June, so the days were really long, and that was wonderful. Something like that. But on the flip side, you still want it to be succinct. You don't want to go into a story where you're saying, yes, so I left my apartment on the 18th floor of the building on 60th Street to get on the D train to switch to the L train to walk over to 3rd Ave, and I got a bagel, but I think the bagel was that you don't want to do all of that. That's not helpful because now you're not telling a story, you're just listing a bunch of descriptions. I always make a joke, and it's weird not seeing anyone's faces, but I always say that you want to be descriptive, but you don't want to write like Tolkien writes. You don't need to go into all that detail because your story is probably at most going to be 90 seconds to 2 minutes to kind of share it, and then people stop to lose interest. And so by being descriptive where you can paint a picture, but then by making sure it's still succinct, you're making sure that people are still getting the right message. Humor can really diffuse tension, even in traumatic stories. Sometimes cracking a joke in the right place or including something funny can allow people to say, okay, this is a really dark story, but not everything is terrible. I'm allowed to have hope or something along those lines. The thing with humor, though, is that you absolutely want to prepare it ahead of time. You want to practice it ahead of time. I just made a joke about not being able to see anyone's reactions making a joke. You'll want to run jokes by friends that you have or people that you trust to say, does this fit in here? Is this a bit awkward? Does this work? And make sure that you practice it with the story, that you embed it kind of into the DNA of the story. So that way you're not ever surprised. You're not trying out new jokes for the first time while telling a serious story or trying to make a serious point. And I point that out specifically because a lot of people that go through trauma do use humor as a way to kind of cope with it. And that can be a helpful coping mechanism for people personally, but it can also make an audience of a story incredibly uncomfortable if it's not rehearsed, if it doesn't make sense. If someone says, oh, this person's joking about something serious, but I don't feel comfortable laughing, and then it can just get kind of iffy from there. So again, if humor works and it works for you, go for it. It can be helpful, but just practice it ahead. And then including in your story a few statistics can add some credibility to your story. It can add a universe. It can make your story universal. I was about to make a huge noun there. It can really help people to see that, oh, hey, this story is not just about this one person. This applies to 25% of LGBTQ people or something along those lines. You don't want to then bog your story down with stats because then people will kind of drift away. Adding one or two into a story can be a great way to make the story bigger than yourself, but you don't want to just make it a report that's just based in statistics. And then the last thing to kind of keep in mind with your story is that it's most helpful to tie your story to a goal. It can be either short-term or long-term. It can be something like, and that's why I want you to turn out and vote for this proposition in the town election on Tuesday. Or it can be something long-term saying, and that's why I want you to stand up for people who are being bullied. And just give the audience something to do. People respond best when they walk away from a story, they hear the message, and they say, okay, I know what to do now. I'm not trying to guess about it. That's another great way to take your personal story and make it universal. You are able to then have people say, oh, I can help a large group of people with this. And when telling your story, you can even make this moral or this goal as simple as easily accessible as saying, and that's why XYZ. Draw the conclusion for your audience. Make it very clear. Again, your story is likely going to be 90 seconds to 2 minutes long. If people hear the end of it, then they'll remember that goal in that amount of time. If you make it very clear, don't leave it up in the air to make people say, oh, I don't know what Mackenzie wanted me to do. Make it very clear what the action is, and then people are more likely to take that action or at least know what you were telling your story for.
That was fantastic. Really helpful sort of points in there. One thing that stood out to me, and this was sort of early on in what you were saying, was, that even if you have a story that maybe, and I'm trying to think how to say this in a way that makes it sound like your story is negative or bad, but even if you have a story where you didn't do the right thing, that you now know better, that's usable, right? Because I think sometimes we might think, well, I didn't handle that the right way, and now I know better, and I'm sort of embarrassed about kind of the way I acted in the past, and may not think that is usable. But do you think that's just as usable or even maybe more effective at times when talking to certain audiences?
I think it is definitely just as usable, especially when we're considering the movable middle that Reina was talking about. Sometimes it helps to tell a story like that because if people in the room are not experts, and apologies if you can hear the dogs outside barking, even if the people you're talking to aren't experts on something, or if they're kind of conflicted somewhere in the middle, by saying, hey, you know what, I wasn't always an expert on this. Now I work at GLAAD, now I have to be an expert on this or I would not be good at my job. In the past, I was not necessarily up to date with all the terminology that I am now, or I might have used the wrong language, or I might have done something incorrectly or bad or something that was less than stellar, but I was able to grow and learn, and you are able to grow and learn. And that can be an incredibly impactful, helpful story for people to hear.
Yeah, and going off of what Mackenzie said, there's a lot of power in, as the person who has the microphone, showing your own vulnerabilities and then therefore like opening up your audience to vulnerabilities. Just like Mackenzie said, it's like if you admit you're not perfect, then like it's much easier. It lowers the defenses of the audience to admit like they're not perfect. And so it's like if you can be vulnerable, they can be vulnerable. Ideal. Everyone's vulnerable.
Absolutely.
I think that makes a lot of sense. I think at the end of the day, and I just know for myself personally, it does come down to authenticity, right? And vulnerability is part of that. And it's something really powerful a lot of times. And people say, oh, okay, I'm allowed to change my mind about something. And and that's actually, when we go out and into the community, and I lead different trainings around LGBTQ competency and creating safe spaces and things like that. That's one of the slides I put up at the very beginning, which is I'm allowed to change my mind about something. It's said better on that slide, but the idea being, what, we don't know a lot of times what we don't know until we realize we didn't know it, and so that's part of the experience. So that makes a lot of sense. I really appreciate you saying that, because I think that might embolden some people who might feel like, oh, I don't know if I have anything to share,
Right.
that they do have something to share. So that's really great.
Yeah, absolutely.
So along the lines, you've given some great sort of steps and really like nuts and bolts how to think about creating your story. But we were talking about this ahead of time. You said you were talking about building bridges, and I guess knowing your audience is a part of that conversation. Is that can you speak more to that?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a lot of, it like starts on knowing your audience, but also like knowing your own story and what bridges it can build. And we sort of go through this like in our trainings of how to tell your story, and like this series of like framing and messaging that story so it can be most effective. And so that's sort of like a thing of how you're telling your story is as important as why you're telling your story and what you're saying. It's like every part of that like makes it together in the specific instance you find yourself in. So framing, it's sort of like you have facts, you have an issue, but like how do you make those facts and issues relevant to who you're talking to and relevant to yourself? And then you just so what you do, what a big thing for that is sort of like making sure that you're not saying against anything, you're saying for something. So I think that's really important. Is just, for example, if you're talking about statistics of hate crimes, everyone has heard like we need to stop these, and which is a like perfect example of this is the Black Lives Matter movement. It's not saying like something doesn't matter, it's saying this does matter. Like that simple framing of those three words is saying like this is what does matter, this is what you need to fight for. And then sort of like the messaging of it. So that's a side of like how your words can impact people, and like how you say those words is really important. And then the messaging, that's also the messaging. Oops, I said framing, I meant messaging. But so just sort of like putting that in perspective and then like choosing your words carefully. And there's also ways that, in this business is the wrong word, but like where we are, we know that there are certain words that are used against us. And I think it's very important to not repeat those words back. So in a similar way, it's like if somebody says a stereotype to you in an interview, like instead of saying, no, it is not that, be like, say what it is. So it gives you the upper hand to be the person who is, breaking that down without repeating toxic messaging back at them. So basically it's just that thing of having a positivity is sort of a too much of an overt word. It doesn't mean like, yay, always think positive. It's more like always know what you're saying, and don't say it in a condescending way, and don't say those negative things back. Just, say what it is you came here to say, and you can always bring it back to what your message is. And like it can even be so abrupt as someone saying like, is it true, that insert stereotype about trans people that I'm not repeating because it would be bad. And then instead of saying it is not true, being like, there are a lot of misconceptions about the trans community in my experience, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I did it just there. I didn't repeat any stereotypes. And there's a way to do that. It's a line to walk where do that and like correct people if they're wrong, but there's a way to do that without talking down to them. So just sort of be conversational, be easy. Like Mackenzie said earlier, know your boundaries. So, you don't want to, if someone says something absolutely hateful to you, you don't want to be like, well, that's interesting. But, do a thing of being like, I didn't know this actually, but blah, 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 blah. And being like, I used to think that. And just sort of the way of like, at the end of the day, whether you're talking to your neighbor or whether you're being interviewed, you are two people having a conversation. So you can always go back to that. And like, you don't have to like, make it such an us versus them thing. And yeah, so you don't have to like invalidate what anyone says. You can just like treat it like a conversation. And then you can always go back to common ground. So this is, it's like what I was saying earlier about identifying your audience, like, and hopefully like you'll know what you're going into, whether it's someone just a conversation you're having, or it's if you're doing political advocacy, if you're doing a media interview, like you should be prepared beforehand to know about them. And like, you can always bring it back to that common ground. And like, at the end of the day, we're all people. And so, which is another point, is like, if you are messaging, even if it is about policies or laws, like why we have these policies or laws, like is about people. And it's often about people we know and people we are. So you can always, a lot of people get bogged down in like very specific language about like a specific bill or a specific law, and they like say some numbers, and then your audience just sort of zones out. So when you're talking about something, you can just always bring it back to the people, because everything in our lives, whether like affects this community, like that's what all these policies do. So, and it's like, this affects me. I'm just a person who, goes to work, but not right now. But I'm just a person, we all eat lunch. We're all doing it. Like, I eat lunch, but I'm also could be discriminated against in this many states. So it just can always work to like bring it back to your common humanity. And then I think another thing is just to sort of, with this messaging, like make sure that you're always clear about like what you know and what like the other person might not know. So a lot of times with this, a thing they will ask is like, yeah, but we're all good now, right? And so I think it's important when telling your story to still illustrate the world we live in. So that what I just said about like, I don't have housing protection in this many states. I should know the number, but it's changed recently. Just sort of, that might not be something people know. And it's also it's very effective to say like, I don't, or like me and my girlfriend could like, be denied housing in the state of South Carolina. That makes it a lot more powerful than being like, these discrimination laws still exist. If you say, I could be discriminated against, or if you're an ally, you can say like my family or my friends or like, anyone then that just makes it hit emotionally, and it goes back to that. And so even just like one sentence like that, it is a personal story in its own way, just saying like, this could happen to me. And a lot of people still don't know that. And then and it just always works to go back to that shared emotional value. And like, no matter where anyone stands, like, even if you don't agree with them, like it's like, we all care about other people, right? No one's going to deny that. So you can always bring it back to that. And then there's for sort of telling these stories and building bridges, like people, it works a lot to like bring it back to a place of support and be like, this is how, this is a little cliched, but like how things got better. And so if you're telling a story and like it just sort of ends, and even if it is what we were talking about earlier, where like you didn't make the right call, you can talk about your journey of learning to make the right call, or being like, because of this I learned that, or like, and then after I had this conversation with my mom, she listened to me more. So it just sort of provides a groundwork of when that person goes to repeat the story or tell their own story, it's like, look at how effective this is. And it's sort of proof within that you're like, building that bridge of being like, this worked for me, it can work for you, et cetera, et cetera. And then you can always also bring it back to, so it's sort of a thing of being like, I'm going to avoid the policy language to tell something very personal, and then we're going to hit it back with the policy language. So it's sort of like a thing of figuring out when that switch happens. for example, I was a while ago before I worked at GLAAD, I worked in a campaign that was just for a ballot initiative to raise the minimum wage. So I would tell voters over the phone, I would be like, vote yes on Prop 12 anyway, and then be like, I worked at an ice cream shop all summer, and it was like, if I, didn't have like 5 roommates, I couldn't pay rent, and that was 40 hours a week, and we need to raise the wage anyway, vote yes. So it's just like a thing of trying to tell that story to get back to your point, because it's often easy to get caught up in it and be like, and anyway, this happened to me, whew, that's an emotion, and then forget the action line. So that's just an important thing to do. And then Mackenzie, if you want to talk about more the logistics of that kind of like pitching out to people with using all these tools.
Totally. Chase, did you have any questions about any of that? That was a lot of information, but I'm happy to go on.
It was a lot. No, I mean, it was a lot of really great information, and not to, derail you. And if you want to circle back around to this, that works too. But I'm of course thinking about the context of South Carolina, thinking about what's really timely and happening here, and the conversation around hate crime legislation is forefront in our minds. It's forefront in a lot of folks' minds. If you listen to NPR every morning now, they're talking about hate crimes and especially after the incident in Georgia, and we're revisiting this point that there are 4 states in our country that do not have hate crime legislation. Georgia is one. South Carolina is also one. So it's also sort of reviving that conversation at the State House. There are a couple different bills that are up there currently. And so there may very well be people who are thinking about, okay, I want to go and advocate, related to this bill. Not to put you on the spot, but could you speak to some specifics around how you might position that? And you made some really good points about not perpetuating the negative, and not letting people off the hook with, well, it's just so much better than it used to be, though. Can you speak at all to that? And again, I'm putting you on the spot with that specific sort of thing.
Right. I'll say a couple things, and then if Raina has more to add, but a few things that I'm thinking about is just if it's advocating for hate crimes protections, if that's the goal, a really great way to go about that would just be to emphasize all of the positive that could come of that law, saying with these protections in place, then people who are discriminated against, who have hate crimes committed against them, are going to be safer. And then if you're someone who has been through something traumatic like that, it could be helpful, even if, since it's a growing campaign kind of thing, someone who has been through that situation without protections, to talk about how that played out and how protections could really help them. And then maybe someone who has been through it in a state where there were protections and able to explain how they were more likely to get justice. I know that, of course, these things happen everywhere still, very, very unfortunately. And media work helps to hopefully cause people to want to commit less of these types of crimes. But in a state where these protections are in place, if justice was then served, being able to talk about it and say, and these protections were able to give guidance, so that way I went through this and it wasn't for nothing. My attacker had to face justice for what they did. And then kind of comparing them and saying, this is what South Carolina could be. South Carolina could be a place that people are protected from this. And it is a hard situation because it is negative. It is hard. You don't want to deny the severity of it. But being able to build out kind of a vision for how you imagine your state to be can be really helpful. And then going back, as Raina said, a lot, because it is so important, emphasizing common ground. People who are different races, different sexual orientations, gender identities, you're all South Carolinians. I'm saying this because I don't live in South Carolina, but I'm building community here. Something like that. For me, I could say something like, we all grew up in Massachusetts. That's where I'm from. But being able to say, we are all South Carolinians. We all experience this. We all different factors of life in South Carolina and say, and this is what we could be. We could have this very positive vision of our state, and these protections are a great first step to get there, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Raina, I didn't know if you wanted to add anything.
Not much. I think Mackenzie made a lot of great points. Yeah, I think it's just sort of reemphasizing that like the word positive doesn't have to mean like you can't really tell a positive story about hate crimes, but just that way of, I think there is the tool that exists is that I'm trying to do math here. 46 states do have the protections and acts, so you do have those examples to point to of being like, this is what happened. And there's also a thing, a case to be made that is relevant to the Georgia shooting and things like that. That's like has been used a lot in the messaging around it is like what he was running. So it's sort of a thing that common ground is like, I would go, this is a hypothetical, I don't jog, but like I could go out for a jog and like I would be fine, like, because I am a white person essentially. But so just sort of that is also common ground of being like, this, you could be in that situation, your sons and daughters can be in that situation, like any, like just sort of putting somebody in the shoes of like, if this happened to your loved ones, like how would you react? And like we need to put everything in place so this does not happen to you and your loved ones, as sort of a way of emphasizing common ground.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So as we're sort of drawing to a close here and coming to the end, thinking about your elevator pitch and how you've got just a couple minutes and making the most of that time and what goes into that and deciding, is your pitch the same for everyone? Is what is that like? Can you speak to that sort of angle?
Absolutely. So at GLAAD, because we do media work, we do a lot more around media pitching. So that's kind of the slant that we have talking about it, but it can apply to political pitches, etc. But pitching is kind of a very straightforward 5-sentence example or communication of your main message, of the main work that you're doing. And reporters are often on the lookout for compelling stories that engage their audience because they want stories that are going to get clicks, get ad views, etc. And there are different ways to do pitching. In normal times and non-pandemic times, it could be something like you could meet a reporter, meet a legislator or something and talk to them for a couple of minutes, give them not your story in the same way we talked about earlier, but a version of that story. Because we are under stay-at-home orders, things like sending emails, giving phone calls, virtual, even tweeting, DMs on Twitter, on Instagram, etc., are great ways to kind of go about that. And so when making a pitch, consider the timing, because reporters are on a deadline. Legislators are not on a deadline in the same way, but if there's no legislation that's going to be coming up around the issue that you're talking about, your pitch is going to be less impactful, your story will be less impactful. It might be something they might put in their books and come back to in 6 months' time or something, but you want to keep an eye out. You want to make sure that you're talking about things that are relevant at the time. Try to find a way to hook interest, especially with reporters. A lot of stories do start, unfortunately, to sound the same, so finding any way that you can kind of stand out is really helpful in connecting to bigger pictures or anything like that. I said before, this is a very short paragraph, really. 5 sentences is a great way to think about it. So what you want to do is you want to put the essential information into that paragraph when you're sending out a pitch. So include just the facts that you need, names and details within the pitch itself, and then offer yourself as a resource. Say, here's what happened, short blurb of it. A reporter can then reach out if they're interested, or a legislative aide or something might say, oh, I want to hear more about this, we could use this, something along those lines. Make sure that you know the issues to some extent. When we were talking about storytelling, we do have power as real everyday people. We don't necessarily have to be experts on every single thing, but if we're pitching ourselves as a resource, we should know the issues that we're talking about. We should be able to talk about a variety of aspects of what we're reaching out about, and to be a resource beyond that. So especially with media stories, having some photos, background information, other relevant sources, so that it makes it easier for the reporter to tell the story. And then what's helpful about keeping pitching in mind is that, yes, you can do some pitching, you can tell your story a little bit to people in power, but by working with the media as well, by telling your story in media, that puts more pressure on legislators. If your story gets picked up, if a reporter tells your story, shares your story, it becomes a bigger news item, then it's more likely that legislators are going to have to respond. To go back to the situation in Georgia, that's kind of a key example. It's an incident that happened in February that was then ignored, and it became a really big thing because activists on Twitter and Instagram put it forward, and it came across the eyes of people across the country and reporters across the country, and so it became a big story, and it forced action from the police department. And that was a successful example of that. It's not always going to be that big, of course, but that's how pitching your story can really help, and how you can kind of have two different approaches. You can be talking to politicians, you can also be talking to media. And then lastly, just kind of a practical thing to advise is to document your progress. Keep track of who you're sending pitches to. Say, okay, I emailed my state rep, I emailed my state senator, emailed my mayor, city councilor, etc. I talked to a reporter here, these reporters here. Just make sure that you know who you've sent things to and who's getting back to you, and know kind of where it is, just for your own awareness. And that's just a practical kind of aspect of it.
That's great. Raina, anything to add to that? I'm putting you on the spot again.
I mean, I think they covered the basics of it. I think a key thing is, and it can be translated to like an elevator pitch, or like, you can be like, if you have these tools in mind, it can be, when you're writing down and composing an email to a journalist, but this can also be like, if you are at a coffee shop and you run into someone and one of these issues comes up, like you already have the tools, so you can like tell your 90-second story, or you can be like, oh, hey, there is, this meeting of all these advocates to discuss this. So I think once you have this in like sort of more formal ways, or if you've pitched to a journalist or, talk to someone, these can become like tools for like a conversational pitch to your friends and neighbors who might not be aware of an issue or something. So yeah, so we specialize in doing media pitches, but like everything that like you can say to the media, you can also say to your like personal networks, whether that be friends, neighbors, family, or like people on the internet. So you always have these resources to talk to anyone, to share your story or to pitch it out.
That's awesome. And I think a really good thing to keep in mind, which is, this does work conversationally, having, these conversations, and you don't always get, 30 minutes to talk about why something is important to you with friends and family and whoever else you might be, sharing your story with. And so practice with your friends, practice in spaces that are not high pressure like media, or even sitting down with a legislator or a council person. As we're sort of wrapping this up, I was just in my mind going through the different spaces where you can use this. And yeah, we just talked about conversationally, but when I'm talking to people here in the Charleston, South Carolina area, keep in mind that your city council meetings are always open to the public. Your county council meetings are always open to the public. There's always a section in those meetings where there's a time for public comment, and you can talk about anything. You don't have to just talk about whatever's on the agenda. And a lot of times that's a way to raise awareness about something that maybe they're not thinking about. And there's always media there. So you never know when what you're able to share in those spaces could really lead to even greater change. So there's no end to where you can use your story and how powerful it is. As we're wrapping up, is there anything you all wanted to share that you didn't have a chance to share today?
Not particularly about the presentation itself, but I did just want to point to a couple of things that GLAAD is currently doing. We currently have basically a story hub about COVID-19 and its impacts on the LGBTQ community. We're building out, there's new content regularly, but you can reach that at glaad.org/COVID, and GLAAD is spelled GLAAD. And then we also have had we've been doing an ongoing campaign about the blood ban against gay, bisexual, and men who have sex with men, donating their blood, because there's in our mind, discriminatory practice that gay and bisexual men aren't allowed to donate blood despite stigma around HIV and AIDS being lesser. We have had some good luck. The FDA has revised the ban to be 3 months since a previous sexual encounter rather than a full year, but we're still working on trying to just get the ban eliminated completely. So if you check out GLAAD on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, again, GLAAD, you can find out ways to get involved with that campaign and other campaigns we're working on. So I just wanted to give our little elevator pitch with a couple of projects we're on, but those are just a few examples to get involved.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for, yes, please continue to share what GLAAD is doing. Y'all are doing amazing work, and we're so grateful for all that your organization does around the world. So as we're wrapping up here, I want to thank my guests so much for joining us today, Mackenzie Hart and Raina Deerwater from GLAAD. The information you shared today is so powerful, and we had people that were able to view it here online, live on Facebook. This will also go out to YouTube, so it'll be searchable out there, and it'll be great content for whoever finds it there, and then also on our website. And so thank you for giving your time today to be able to share this really important information. Really, really grateful for you.
Having us.
Yes, thank you. It was a great time. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm just gonna wrap things up here. Um, Thank you everyone who was able to join us today. AFFA has been planning a number of virtual programs. We're going to continue along this vein. That's one thing that's been really great, is an opportunity for us to really kind of expand our reach in the community, and this sort of programming is a part of that. I would be remiss if I did not share information about a resource here locally that is collecting personal stories. This very much connects with what we talked about today. The LGBTQ Archive at the College of Charleston. This is an archive that's collecting specifically stories around LGBTQ community, the individuals in our community, and they want to hear your story. There is no story too short or too long. They're collecting anything and everything they can. I've put the email address up there as well as the web address to the archive. There are lots of stories that have already been put out there. You can hear recordings, you can read transcripts. They're collecting physical items as well, which is important to note. So if you have been a part of the community for years, and maybe you've collected shirts or brochures or newsletters or any sort of bumper stickers or anything, I'm just randomly naming objects now, but they want to be able to collect those sorts of things as well, because they know that that's how we continue to be able to tell our story. So keep that in mind as you go about thinking about your story and the power in that. And then finally, one more thing before we wrap up. We have a program next Wednesday, and the program, I'm so excited about this one. We are hosting DeLeslin George Warren from the Catawba Indian Nation. He's a queer artist. Lives on the reservation, does work with the community in lots of different areas, but food sovereignty and cultural healing, and it's going to be a really fascinating conversation. I'm excited that I get to sit down with him and talk about just his life in general, his experiences, but also we'll talk specifically about COVID-19, the impact that this public health crisis is having on Indigenous communities, and specifically the Catawba Indian Nation. And so I'm excited about this program. I hope you'll join us next week, next Wednesday, 12 p.m. Eastern. We would love to see you there. So one more thing before we go. I want to just say, AFFA is a nonprofit organization, and if you are appreciative of the work that we're doing in the community. We would appreciate any support that you're able to give. And the same for GLAAD. Nonprofits are also experiencing challenges right now. And so put that out there that if you have the means to support financially, I know both of our organizations would be grateful for that support and would just be grateful to connect with you in that way. But these programs are not 100% solely dependent on your support. We'll continue to do this as long as we can. And we're just grateful for the people that were able to join us today. All right. Thank you again to Mackenzie Hart and Raina Dearwater from GLAAD and all that they do. And thank you all for joining us. And we will see you again next week. Take care.